Last time we talked about small perc and making your own sounds. This week, we're going to tackle the big stuff. Action! Let's do it. I hope since the last video you tried making some sounds on your own. Now the stuff I showed you was a little more on the subtle side, but aggressive use of gates and transient shapers and distortion can get you more intense stuff as well. And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a video on synth sounds and how to make those out of virtually any source material. And that can be for soft stuff and for aggressive stuff. We'll cover that then. Okay, so action perc. If you're doing a big action arrangement, it can easily get out of hand if you're not careful. Now, even if you want this big wall of sound, it pays to pick instruments that are going to complement each other rather than mask each other. Now, you might be wondering what I mean by masking. Well, two instruments that produce similar frequencies are going to compete for the same sonic space in such a way they can end up hiding one or both instruments, which muddies the sound. And if all your sounds have massive low end and you're trying to do really busy parts, well, the low is just going to build up and you're going to get an ugly mess. And remember, you still got the rest of the orchestra to compete with. Okay, first let's talk about instrument selection and programming. One simple rule: bigger the drum or the lower the pitch, the fewer the notes. Now, I'm a big fan of cheesy graphics, so I'm going to show this to you like this. See? Cheesy, but I like it. Big giant drum at the bottom, a lot of ring out, takes up a lot of sonic space, only room for one of those. Slightly smaller, surdos or low toms, anything like that, or small taikos, you can be a little more busy. Tiny drums above that, rototoms, or could be bongos if the movie calls for it. And then above that is the small stuff, hi-hats or tickies, that kind of thing. Tons of room for those. At first, I was going to write and mix this thing in real time, and I realized that was an insanely stupid idea. So let me just show you what I did. I always start with some sort of anchor, something more than click, something that gives me the prevailing pulse of the piece. And it can be whatever drum you like. If it's all 16s, it's all 16s. If it's a syncopation thing, do that. In this case, the piece is in 5/4. I chose a little bass drum thing that would just give me the main pulse, and I could build everything around that. We'll start there. So the bass drum. It's the boomiest drum, so it's got the fewest notes. That's the prevailing rhythm that I want. So on top of that, I added a taiko, doing almost the same rhythm. A little later on, it gets more. A little more busy. And then on top of that, I added a second taiko. Now, this HC taiko has a lot of stick in the transient, so it cuts pretty well. That's one of the cool things about the MIDI Pro. This is not paid, by the way, but they give you various mixes, not just from Hans, but from Junkie XL, Steve Lipson, Alan Meyerson, Jeff Foster. So you get a range of sounds right off the bat. Now the price tag on this stuff can be a little crazy. So this is why it's good to know how to mix your percussion. You can get more out of those existing samples, as I've mentioned in a past video. I don't hyper quantize every single part. I like to leave a little bit of play in there on some of the parts to keep things lively. Now, bear in mind when you start editing, those little imperfections can lead to little bits of MIDI left over. So if you're chopping at a bar line, you might have a little snippet of MIDI there that could cause double triggers or weird flams. Now, Cubase does have a function, and I'm sure the other DAWs have it as well. You can go to MIDI, functions, delete notes, and tell it to delete notes that are just, let's say, under 10 ticks. That'd be the kind of thing that would be left over after an edit. Now, let's look at this HC taiko part. This is the track, actually, before I did any editing on it. There's a couple of steps I like to do when I'm programming to make the whole process easier. Now, I won't say I do this every time, but it does help when working on a lot of parts, especially if there's a lot of syncopation and complicated MIDI. Now, first, either due to latency or bad playing, I end up in front of the beat a lot. At the very least, not on the beat, but in front of it a lot. I'm going to blame the latency, though. But luckily, I have a button on my iPad here that can move everything, either a whole frame or just 10 ticks at a time. Now these are set up in Logical Editor, and I'm triggering them with the iPad running Metagrid, but they're really easy to make. If you need to know how, please DM me and I'll give you instructions. Now the second thing I do is quantize the lengths. Now in the menus, this is over here under MIDI Functions Fixed Lengths. Now it will quantize the lengths based on whatever your grid is. So in this case, my grid was 1/8 notes. But you can see over here, I'm actually playing 16ths. So we're gonna undo that, change the grid to 16th, go back and fix lengths. This helps me see anything that's kind of out of whack when I start cleaning the MIDI up. So now when I go to quantize it, if I were to move that forward by a little bit, now I can start easing those parts together. Now, I've mentioned track delay or pre-delay in the past, and even though percussion tends to be pretty responsive, you still need to check the instrument against the click. So let's go to this bass drum. I'm going to turn off pre-delay entirely, and we'll listen to it against the click track. Now, I think it's pretty clear that bass drum is way behind the click. So we need to advance the part enough that they line up. Now, this is something you can do by ear, or you can just put in the values that the manufacturer gives you. I prefer to do it by ear because it does train your ears to hear imperfections, hear errors, and know how to fix them. So in this case, the number was 60 milliseconds. And in this case, that bass drum was quantized, hyper quantized to the beat. I didn't soft quantize it because I wanted it to be really rock solid. Now, after I've done all that, let's go back to the taiko part, for instance. After I've worked on make sure the pre-delay is set correctly and I've quantized it where I want, I can now either limit or compress or expand the velocities. Now, if you remember from last time, I can just up and down, compress, scale around a value. I can even set them all to one value if I want. Anyway, here is our low perc. Okay, to move things along, the next thing I added was this surdo. This is from the Holkenberg perc. Now, this is in mid perc, but it's actually a larger sound than the taiko in the low perc. It all depends on how it's recorded and mixed, and you know, I've just put them by size of the drum, but sometimes you use them in different ways. In this case, I kept the pattern pretty simple just because I wanted to add heft. Now, there's a lot of transient there as well, so it does cut through. But you have to remember that if you're programming, you need to take into account what this is playing with. You don't want an overly busy pattern that's going to obscure the rest of the orchestra or create more clutter. You know, sometimes simple is better. Now, next up, I've added a snare pattern. Now, in this case, I copy pasted, which is what I said not to do last time, but in this case, I want everything to be exactly the same, totally in lockstep. And then on top of that, I added a hi-hat. Occupy the top end. Okay, so first of all, yes, costume change. Second of all, as I suspected, that video was starting to get a little on the long side, and so getting into the mixing thing was going to be another 10 minutes. So we're going to stop there. This gives you the most basic outline of perc programming, basically just the idea of what kind of drums to select and how to program them. Always think about what you're playing against. If you've got car engines and explosions and gunfire, you need drums that can cut. If you've got dialogue suddenly, you got to think about what drums to get rid of maybe for a brief moment. If you've only got strings and percussion, well, you don't need as much mid-range as maybe you would if you had brass playing. So lots of things to think about that I didn't get into, but we will cover a little bit more of that when we get to the mix section. That'll be coming really soon because it's actually shot, just need to cut it. If you're liking these videos, please hit the buttons and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.